What if I told you there was a weapon so terrifying that hardened Taliban fighters refused to leave their homes after dark? What if I told you that elite American Navy SEALs, the best of the best, stood frozen in shock watching something they could not explain? What if I told you that in the mountains of Afghanistan there were ghosts that hunted with 4 eyes and left no witnesses? You think you know everything about the war in Afghanistan? Think again, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you understood about modern warfare. The story you are about to hear has been whispered in classified briefings, muttered in terror by captured insurgents, and buried in reports that never made it to the public. This is not about helicopters or drones or fancy missiles. This is about men who became something more than human, something darker, something that still haunts the nightmares of an entire insurgency. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment, 4 letters that made grown men weep, 4 tubes on their faces that turned them into gods of the night, $50,000 of technology strapped to each skull, giving them vision that defied nature itself. While American forces waited for authorization, for backup, for the perfect moment, these bearded ghosts were already inside, already ending lives, already gone before anyone knew they were there. 90 seconds. That is all it took. 90 seconds to clear an entire compound, neutralize 7 hostiles, capture a high-value target, and vanish like smoke. How? What did they have that made them unstoppable? Taliban commanders put bounties on their heads. Enemy fighters deserted rather than faced them. Coalition partners watched in disbelief as these wild-eyed Australians rewrote the rules of engagement and laughed at procedures that everyone else followed religiously. They did not just fight in the dark, they lived there, they thrived there, they became the darkness itself. And the technology they used, it was not just better equipment, it was a fundamental transformation of what human beings could do when the sun went down. But here is what nobody wants to talk about. Here's the part that got buried in classified files and swept under the rug. What happens to men when you give them godlike power? What happens when you can see everything, hear everything, end lives with the casual ease of swatting flies? What happens when you spend 10, 11 deployments hunting humans in the dark until you forget what it means to be human yourself? The cost was catastrophic. The price was paid in shattered minds, broken marriages, and bodies found hanging in garages years after the war ended. This is not a feel-good story about heroes. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what happens when technology meets violence, when training meets darkness, when men become predators so perfect that coming home becomes impossible. The American military studied them, copied them, tried to replicate their success. They could not, because what the SASR did required more than equipment. It required a willingness to cross lines that most people do not even know exist. Stay with me until the end of this video, because I am going to show you exactly how 4 tubes of night vision technology terrorized an entire country, why Taliban fighters called them the 4-eyed demons, and what happened when these apex predators finally came home to discover they could not turn it off. The secrets, the techniques, the psychological horror of being hunted by something you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot escape. Everything is about to be revealed. You will not believe what you're about to discover. Let me show you the horrors of the 4-eyed ghosts. The American Navy SEAL crouched behind the mud brick wall, his heart hammering against his chest plate. The Afghan village ahead was swallowed by darkness so complete it felt like staring into the void itself. Standard procedure dictated they wait for the AC-130 gunship overhead to light up the target building with infrared beams. Standard procedure meant coordinating with the quick reaction force on standby. Standard procedure had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. Tonight, that was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. 3 kilometers away, invisible in the moonless night, the Australian SASR patrol was already moving. They had been lying in the dirt for 11 hours, unmoving, watching the compound through optics that turned darkness into their personal hunting ground. The American had no idea they were even there. The Taliban inside the compound had no idea either. That was exactly how the Australians wanted it. What happened next would rewrite everything the SEAL thought he knew about night warfare. The SEAL adjusted his PVS-15 dual-tube night vision goggles and grimaced. The familiar green glow gave him maybe 40 degrees of vision, like looking through toilet paper tubes. His peripheral vision was completely blind. Every few seconds, he had to physically turn his head to scan the flanks, a movement that felt painfully slow and exposed. He had trained thousands of hours with this limitation, learned to work around it, accepted it as the price of seeing in the dark. Acceptance did not mean he liked it, but this technological handicap was nothing compared to what he was about to witness. The radio crackled in his ear. Command wanted confirmation of enemy positions. The drone feed was inconclusive. The thermal imaging showed heat signatures, but could not differentiate between fighters and civilians. The rules of engagement required positive identification before weapons release. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should, which meant everything was moving at the speed of bureaucracy rather than the speed of war. While he waited for authorization, death was already inside the compound. Then something moved in his peripheral vision, or rather, he thought something moved. By the time he swiveled his head to look, there was nothing there, just shadows and the skeletal remains of a burned-out Soviet-era truck. His finger tightened on his rifle, adrenaline spiking. False alarm, probably. The problem with tunnel vision was you could never be sure. What he did not know would haunt him for years. 4 SASR operators had just passed within 15 meters of his position. They moved like smoke, their footfalls silent on the rocky ground. Each man wore a device on his face that looked like something from a science fiction film, the Ground Panoramic Night Vision Goggle, designation GPNVG-18, 4 tubes instead of 2. 97 degrees of horizontal vision instead of 40, the difference between looking through a keyhole and having both eyes wide open. This was not just better equipment, this was a different species of warfare altogether. The lead Australian saw the American SEAL clearly, noted his position, filed it away, and kept moving. There was no need to announce their presence, no need to coordinate. The Australians had learned long ago that the fewer people who knew they were coming, the cleaner the operation would be. Besides, they had been watching this compound since nightfall. They knew exactly how many fighters were inside where they slept, which ones were on guard duty, and which window had the broken latch. The intelligence gathering phase was over. Now came the part they were built for. The American SEAL was still waiting for authorization to move when he heard it. Not an explosion, not gunfire. Something stranger. A sound like canvas tearing, repeated 4 times in rapid succession. Suppressed rifle shots, so quiet they could have been mistaken for someone coughing. Then silence again. He pressed his radio transmit button to report possible contact, but before he could speak, a new sound reached him, screaming, panicked, terrified screaming in Pashto, coming from inside the target compound. But that was just the beginning of the nightmare unfolding behind those walls. The screaming stopped after 6 seconds, cut off mid-shriek as if someone had flipped a switch. The SEAL felt ice water run down his spine. What was happening over there? His team leader was barking questions over the radio. The drone operator was trying to reposition for a better view. Everyone was talking at once, trying to make sense of a situation that had suddenly spiraled into chaos without warning. Meanwhile, the Australians were already extracting, their work completed with surgical precision. The Australian SASR team was already inside the compound when the screaming started. They had not breached the gate, they had not blown the door, they had simply climbed over the wall in 2 seconds flat and moved through the courtyard like shadows given form. The white phosphor tubes in their GPNVGs painted the world in shades of silver, blue, and black, crisp and clear as a winter morning. Every texture stood out, every movement registered instantly across their full field of view. The technology gave them godlike awareness in the darkness. The Taliban guard who had been smoking by the doorway never saw them coming. One moment he was exhaling a cloud of cheap tobacco smoke. The next moment a suppressed round from a Heckler & Koch HK-417 had punched through his brainstem. He dropped without a sound, cigarette still smoldering in the dirt. The Australians flowed past him like water around a stone, already focusing on the next threat. There was no pause, no hesitation, no moment of reflection, just continuous forward motion toward the objective. Inside the main building, 3 fighters were sleeping on thin mattresses. One was awake, reading from a worn Quran by the light of a kerosene lamp. The lamp was a problem. It created a bright flare in the night vision, washing out detail. A less experienced operator might have hesitated, might have lifted his goggles to use natural vision. The SASR operator adjusted his focus with a tiny twist of the dial, compensating for the light bloom, and put 2 rounds into the reading fighter before the man could register what was happening. And the next part would become the stuff of whispered legend among coalition forces. The sleepers perished in their dreams. Quick, professional, executed with the same emotional detachment as a butcher processing meat. This was the part that American Special Operations units struggled to articulate when they talked about working alongside the Australians. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. The SASR moved through violence with the calm efficiency of men who had long since passed beyond the point where ending lives required psychological preparation. They had become something else entirely. Upstairs, the high-value target was reaching for an AK-47 propped against the wall when the door to his room opened. He saw nothing. The room was pitch black, but he felt the presence, some animal instinct screaming that death had just entered his personal space. He opened his mouth to shout a warning and found a gloved hand clamped over his face, yanking his head back with brutal force. A voice whispered in accented Pashto directly into his ear, "You are coming with us. Resist and you perish here." The choice was not really a choice at all. The entire assault had taken 90 seconds from wall breach to target secured, 90 seconds to neutralize 7 hostiles and capture 1 high-value target without firing a shot that could be heard beyond 50 meters. 90 seconds to accomplish what a conventional unit would have needed 15 minutes and a significant support package to achieve. But the speed was not the most terrifying part. What came next would shake the American observer to his core. The American SEAL was still crouched behind his wall, still waiting for clearance to advance, when 4 shapes materialized out of the darkness ahead of him. His rifle came up instinctively, finger on the trigger, heart exploding into overdrive. Then recognition hit. The beards, the non-standard gear, the relaxed, almost casual way they moved despite having just cleared a hostile compound. Australians. The lead SASR operator gave him a small nod as they passed, dragging their hooded prisoner between them. No words, no explanation. They simply vanished back into the night as silently as they had appeared. Command was shouting over the radio now, demanding to know what had happened. The drone feed showed bodies inside the compound, but no indication of who had put them there. The American SEAL took a breath and keyed his mic. He tried to explain what he had just witnessed, but the words felt inadequate. How do you describe ghosts? How do you report that the impossible had just occurred right in front of you? The answer was simple. You could not. Not in any way that made sense to people who had not seen it themselves. The technology on the faces of those Australian operators represented a revolution in night warfare that most people still did not fully comprehend. The GPNVG-18 was not just an incremental improvement over standard night vision. It was a fundamental reimagining of how humans could operate in darkness. $40,000 to $60,000 per unit. 4 image intensifier tubes working in concert to create a panoramic view that eliminated tunnel vision completely. White phosphor technology that provided sharper contrast and reduced eye fatigue compared to the traditional green phosphor glow. But the hardware was only half the story. The real weapon was what it did to the men who wore it. Technology alone did not explain what he had just seen. Plenty of American units had access to advanced night vision. Delta Force used similar gear. DevGru had equipment that cost even more. The difference was not the hardware. The difference was the mentality. The Australians did not just use the night as a tactical advantage, they inhabited it. They became nocturnal predators, rewiring their sleep cycles and their psychology to think of darkness as their natural environment and daylight as the aberration. This transformation had consequences nobody was prepared to discuss publicly. An American special operator once described it like this: "We own the night because we have better technology. The Aussies own the night because they are actually comfortable there. They do not treat it as a hostile environment to overcome, they treat it as home." This subtle distinction made all the difference when rounds started flying and decisions had to be made in fractions of a second. The Australians did not think in the dark. They simply acted, their bodies and minds perfectly synchronized with an environment that would paralyze most people with fear. The SASR selection course included a phase that American observers found deeply unsettling. Candidates were required to conduct extended patrols in complete darkness, sometimes for 5 or 6 nights in a row, with minimal sleep, not training for night operations, actually living nocturnally, eating in the dark, navigating in the dark, making life or perishing decisions in the dark until their circadian rhythms shifted and they stopped flinching every time a shadow moved. By the time they deployed to Afghanistan, these men were not just equipped to fight at night, they preferred it, and that preference would terrorize an entire insurgency. The darkness was their force multiplier, their psychological edge, their overwhelming advantage, and the four-tubed panoramic night vision was the tool that unlocked the full potential of that advantage. The Taliban learned to fear the night in ways their grandfathers who fought the Soviets never had to. Soviet forces had night vision, sure, but it was primitive, unreliable, and in short supply. The Soviets mostly just avoided night operations when possible. The Americans and their coalition partners had no such hesitation. They owned the night so completely that Taliban fighters started referring to them as the jinn of darkness, supernatural beings who could see without light. But even among the coalition forces, the SASR developed a particular reputation that went beyond mere competence. They were the four-eyed ghosts, the bearded specters who appeared without warning and disappeared without trace. Taliban commanders tried to adapt. They posted extra guards at night. They used women and children as early warning systems, knowing coalition forces hesitated to engage non-combatants. They rigged doorbells and crude alarm systems using cans and string. None of it mattered. The countermeasures were like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. The SASR would watch a compound for days, cataloging every routine, every weakness, every pattern. When they finally moved, they came from unexpected angles, over walls instead of through gates, through windows instead of doors. They bypassed the alarms, avoided the guards, and struck with such speed that resistance was impossible. A captured Taliban mid-level commander, interrogated after a failed ambush in Uruzgan province, provided insight into how terrifying this was from the receiving end. His testimony would chill the blood of everyone who heard it. He described waking up to find his guards already down, throats cut or heads caved in with rifle butts. He described seeing nothing but darkness, hearing nothing but his own panicked breathing, and then feeling the cold metal of a rifle barrel pressed against his temple. He insisted his attackers were not human. Humans made noise. Humans could be seen. These things were invisible demons who hunted in the blackest hours before dawn. The interrogators dismissed this as superstition and fear. They were wrong to do so. The terror in his voice was absolutely genuine. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Taliban fighters began refusing guard duty at night. Some deserted entirely rather than face another encounter with the four-eyed ghosts. The ones who stayed became paranoid, jumpy, prone to firing at shadows, and wasting ammunition on phantom threats. Their effectiveness degraded rapidly once they lost confidence in their ability to defend themselves after dark. The SASR had weaponized fear itself, turning the Taliban's own imagination against them in ways no bomb or bullet ever could. The mechanics of the GPNVG-18 system explain part of this dominance. Traditional dual-tube night vision gives you binocular vision but a narrow field of view. You see depth and distance clearly, but your peripheral awareness is terrible. Single-tube monocular systems give you a wider field but sacrifice depth perception. The four-tube panoramic design solves both problems simultaneously. Two center tubes provide binocular overlap for depth perception and clarity in your central vision. Two outer tubes, angled outward at 14 degrees each, extend your peripheral awareness to near-natural levels. But understanding the technology is not the same as understanding what it does to combat effectiveness. The result is a visual picture that feels shockingly normal compared to the claustrophobic tunnel vision of standard NVGs. You can see threats approaching from the sides. You can navigate complex terrain without constantly scanning left and right. You can clear rooms with the same spatial awareness you would have in daylight. The white phosphor tubes add another layer of advantage. Green phosphor, the traditional standard, works by converting photons into green light that your eye can detect. It works well enough, but the human eye is not optimally tuned for green wavelengths. Extended use causes eye strain and fatigue. The next innovation would change everything yet again. White phosphor technology converts photons into a black and white image with blue-gray tones. The human eye is much better at processing this color range. Details stand out more sharply. Textures are more distinct. Shadows have more depth. And critically, you can use the system for hours without your eyes feeling like they are being stabbed with hot needles. For operators conducting all-night patrols or multi-day surveillance operations, this reduction in fatigue is a genuine force multiplier. The SASR pushed this technology to its absolute limits. The SASR also paired their GPNVGs with infrared laser aiming devices, typically the AN/PEQ-15 Advanced Target Pointer Illuminator aiming laser, in the visible spectrum. These devices are completely invisible, no flash, no beam, nothing to give away your position, but through night vision the infrared laser appears as a bright line extending from your rifle to wherever you are aiming. This creates an eerie phenomenon on the battlefield that would become the signature of SASR operations. From the Taliban perspective, their fighters simply start dropping, shot through the head or chest with no visible muzzle flash, no sound louder than a cough, no indication of where the fire is coming from. From the SASR perspective, they are calmly placing a dot on a target and squeezing the trigger, watching the bullet impact exactly where the laser indicated, clinical, precise, emotionless. A British SAS operator who worked alongside the Australians in Helmand Province described watching them clear a Taliban compound during a joint operation. What he saw would fundamentally change his understanding of modern warfare. The Brits were using standard dual-tube NVGs, solid kit, no complaints, but watching the Aussies work was like watching a completely different species. They moved through the compound without any of the careful, methodical clearing procedures the Brits had been taught. No stacking up on doors, no verbal commands or hand signals. They just flowed through the space like they could see through walls, like they already knew where every threat was positioned. One of the British operators asked an Australian sergeant how they moved so fast without tripping over each other or clearing the same room twice. The answer was brutally simple. The Australian just tapped the 4 tubes on his face and said, "Because I can see my whole team at once. I do not need to look left to know where my mate is. I can see him in my peripheral while I'm still looking forward. We do not need to talk because we can all see the same picture." That peripheral awareness was the secret sauce that nobody outside the unit fully appreciated until they saw it in action. But there was a darker implication to this capability that few wanted to acknowledge. With standard NVGs, you are constantly swiveling your head, trying to maintain awareness of your teammates while also watching for threats. It is mentally exhausting and creates gaps in coverage. With panoramic vision, you can maintain situational awareness of your entire team while simultaneously scanning for targets. Your brain is not constantly playing catch-up, trying to piece together a mental map of the battle space from fragmented snapshots. You have the whole picture all the time. This enabled tactics that seem suicidal to conventional thinking. This enabled the SASR to develop clearing techniques that seemed insanely aggressive to outside observers. They would hit a compound with only 4 operators where American doctrine would have called for at least 8 or 12. They would split up inside the building with each operator clearing multiple rooms alone, trusting that their mates were covering adjacent sectors. To someone watching through standard NVGs, it looked like reckless cowboy tactics. To the Australians who could see the entire tactical picture at once, it was simply efficient. But efficiency in ending human lives came with a price tag that equipment budgets never captured. The cost of these systems was staggering. At $50,000 per unit, equipping a single 4-man patrol team cost $200,000 just in night vision. Add in the rifles, optics, suppressed weapons, body armor, communications gear, and other specialized equipment, and you were looking at $1 million investment walking through the Afghan desert. The Australian Department of Defense took heat from budget watchdogs about the expense. Politicians questioned whether such extravagant spending was justified when cheaper alternatives existed. The SASR response would silence the critics permanently. The answer was simple. Count the bodies, count how many high-value targets they captured, count how many ambushes they disrupted, count how many Australian soldiers came home alive because the night belonged entirely and absolutely to their country's most elite warriors. The numbers spoke for themselves. In terms of return on investment, the GPNVG-18 was one of the most effective pieces of military hardware ever purchased. But there was a darker side to this technological superiority, a moral weight that the cheerful cost-benefit analyses never captured. When you give humans the ability to end lives with such ease, such precision, such complete impunity, what does it do to them? When the enemy cannot see you, cannot hear you, cannot fight back, does it still count as combat or does it become something else? An American Marine embedded with the SASR during a partnered operation in Kandahar province later reported an incident that stuck with him for years. The memory would haunt his dreams long after he left the service. They had been observing a suspected Taliban safe house for 2 nights. On the 3rd night, the SASR team leader decided they had enough pattern-of-life intelligence to proceed. The assault went exactly as planned, 7 fighters eliminated in under 2 minutes. 1 high-value target secured for interrogation, clean, professional, textbook. But on the extract walking back through the darkness to their vehicles, the Marine noticed something about the Australians that disturbed him deeply. What he saw would shake his faith in everything he thought he knew about warriors and warfare. They were not celebrating. They were not even particularly energized. They just looked tired, hollow. One of them was eating a protein bar with the same blank expression he might have while waiting for a bus. Another was checking his phone, scrolling through messages from home. They had just ended 7 human lives and captured an 8th, and they were acting like they had just finished a particularly boring administrative task. The Marine tried to process this, tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he understood about combat psychology. He had seen combat before. He knew what adrenaline dumps felt like, the shakes and the nervous energy that came after a firefight, but these guys showed none of that. They had been so far inside their technological advantage, so utterly dominant throughout the entire engagement, that their bodies had not even bothered releasing stress hormones. It was not combat to them. It was pest control. That image haunted him. Not because he thought the Australians were wrong or immoral. The Taliban fighters they had neutralized were legitimate targets, armed combatants actively engaged in an insurgency. But something about the ease of it suggested a line had been crossed. The casual indifference suggested something had changed inside these men. They had crossed a threshold somewhere, past a point of no return, where ending lives no longer registered as a significant event. It was just part of the job. Clock in, eliminate threats, clock out, sleep, repeat. The SASR rotations in Afghanistan were notoriously long. Some operators did 10 or 11 deployments, spending more time in Uruzgan and Helmand than they did in Australia. Night after night of hunting humans, month after month of living nocturnal, rewiring their brains to be predators. Year after year of looking at the world through white phosphor tubes that turn people into targets and darkness into sanctuary. The toll this took would only become clear years later. The psychological cost of that lifestyle is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Post-traumatic stress disorder rates among SASR veterans are significantly higher than the general military population. Divorce rates are catastrophic. Substance issues and self-harm rates paint a grim picture of men who came home with bodies intact but minds shattered. A psychiatrist who treated several SASR veterans described a common pattern, and these were men who had been apex predators, who had owned the night so completely that they felt invincible. Then they came home to a world where they were just regular people. The transition proved impossible for many. They came back to a world subject to traffic laws and mortgage payments and all the mundane indignities of civilian life. The transition was jarring. Some never made it. One veteran described the sensation of walking through a shopping mall at night, seeing civilians laughing and shopping, completely unaware that just 6 months earlier he had been in Afghanistan dropping bodies. The disconnect was so profound, it felt like living in 2 different realities simultaneously. How do you reconcile the person who cleared compounds in 90 seconds with the person buying groceries and making small talk with the cashier? But the tragedy of their homecoming was only one part of the legacy they left behind. The night vision itself became a crutch for some. Veterans reported feeling vulnerable and exposed in darkness without their GPNVGs, even years after leaving service. Their brains had been so thoroughly rewired to associate darkness with predatory advantage that normal human night blindness felt like a disability. Some kept their issued night vision, purchased civilian variants, or built custom systems just to feel safe in the dark again. The equipment that had made them superhuman in Afghanistan had also made them unable to function as normal humans back home. Focusing solely on the psychological cost misses the broader point. The SASR and their four-eyed ghosts fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in Afghanistan. They proved that a small number of highly trained, technologically superior operators could exert strategic influence far beyond their numbers. One four-man SASR patrol could lock down an entire valley, denying freedom of movement to hundreds of Taliban fighters who knew that traveling at night was a sentence of certain ending. And the strategic implications rippled far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The ripple effects of this dominance extended beyond direct combat operations. Taliban fighters who survived encounters with the SASR spread stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. The four-eyed ghosts became legendary figures, attributed with supernatural powers. They could see through walls, they could hear thoughts. They never missed, they never slept. These myths served Australian strategic interests perfectly, creating a psychological barrier that was almost as effective as physical presence. But the mythology was built on a foundation of very real and very lethal capability. Intelligence reports from detainee interrogations consistently showed that Taliban fighters feared night raids by coalition special operations forces more than they feared airstrikes or conventional military sweeps. Airstrikes were impersonal. You could hide from them, shelter in tunnels, or blame divine will if you perished, but the night raids were personal, intimate. You ceased in your sleep, or you woke up with a rifle in your face, and there was no dignity in either scenario. The SASR understood the psychological dimension and weaponized it ruthlessly. The SASR exploited this fear with deliberate campaigns of targeted operations designed not just to remove specific individuals, but to create a climate of terror among mid-level Taliban leadership. If you were important enough to be on their list, but not important enough to have serious security, you were going to cease existing. Maybe tonight, maybe next week, but eventually the four-eyed ghosts would come and you would not even see them until it was too late. This raises uncomfortable questions that military historians still struggle to answer. When one side has such overwhelming technological superiority that combat becomes one-sided elimination, does it still qualify as war, or has it become something closer to execution? International humanitarian law requires that combatants face risk in order for their actions to be considered legitimate warfare. But what risk did SASR operators face when they could see everything move invisibly and end threats from concealment with precision that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier? Legal scholars and ethicists have struggled with these questions without reaching satisfying conclusions. The laws of war were written in an era when combat meant facing your enemy, when battles involved mutual risk and something resembling a fair fight. Modern special operations, especially at night with advanced technology, bear almost no resemblance to that model. The SASR operators were taking risks, certainly. Improvised explosive devices did not care about night vision. A lucky burst of automatic fire could still end your life. But the risk ratio was so skewed toward their advantage that calling it combat feels almost misleading. Yet, from a purely military perspective, this asymmetry was the entire point. You want your forces to have every possible advantage. You want the enemy to be terrified, demoralized, and unable to effectively resist. The SASR achieved this through superior training, superior technology, and superior tactical doctrine. They did not cheat. They did not violate the rules of engagement. They simply played the game at a level the Taliban could not match. The American military took extensive notes on every operation, every technique, every innovation. What they learned would reshape special operations doctrine for a generation. After watching the Australians operate, U.S. Special Operations Command began pushing harder for panoramic night vision adoption. SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force units started fielding GPNVG systems. Training programs were modified to include more emphasis on peripheral awareness and rapid room clearing. The lessons learned from watching the SASR hunt Taliban fighters in the Afghan night influenced American tactics in subsequent operations in Iraq, Syria, and other theaters. But the Americans also recognized they could not simply copy the Australian model wholesale. The SASR approach worked because of a unique organizational culture that prioritized individual initiative and aggressive action. American units had their own strengths, their own organizational DNA that shaped how they fought. What worked for a small, tight-knit force like the SASR might not scale to larger American formations with different command structures and operational requirements. A Delta Force operator who trained with the SASR described the cultural difference with brutal honesty that cut to the heart of the matter. We are both special operations, but we come from different philosophies. Americans love technology and systems. We want repeatable processes that work every time. The Aussies love chaos and adaptability. They want operators who can think on their feet and improvise. Neither approach is wrong. They are just different tools for different problems. The GPNVG-18 was a perfect fit for the Australian philosophy. It gave individual operators the sensory information they needed to make instant decisions without waiting for commands or coordination. But what worked in the Afghan mountains would be tested in ways nobody anticipated. It enabled the kind of fluid, fast-paced operations that played to SASR strengths. In American hands, the same technology was used within a more structured tactical framework, which sacrificed some speed but gained reliability and scalability. By 2014, the SASR had conducted thousands of night operations in Afghanistan. Their ratio of targets eliminated to casualties suffered was staggeringly lopsided. They had captured or neutralized dozens of high-value targets. They had disrupted Taliban command and control networks across multiple provinces, and they had done it while suffering remarkably few losses themselves. The four-eyed ghosts had earned their reputation through brutal effectiveness that the numbers could not fully capture. The war was winding down. International support for the Afghan campaign was collapsing. Politicians were promising to bring the troops home. The SASR began rotating back to Australia, transitioning from combat operations to training cycles and administrative duties. For many of these men, the shift was devastating. They had spent the best years of their lives becoming perfect nocturnal predators. Now they were being told that particular skill set was no longer needed. The hunters were being asked to become civilians, and not all of them could make that journey. Some adapted. They found new challenges, new mountains to climb. They became instructors, passing their knowledge to the next generation. They transitioned to civilian careers where their discipline and problem-solving abilities were valuable. They built families and lives outside the military. These were the success stories, the ones who proved that you could come back from the edge. But for every success story, there were 2 or 3 tragedies that never made the newspapers. Others did not adapt. They carried the night with them, a darkness that no amount of therapy or medication could fully dispel. They saw four-toothed phantoms in their peripheral vision, ghosts of the men they had been when ending lives was simple and purpose was clear. Some self-destructed slowly through alcohol and pills. Others ended it quickly with firearms or ropes. The statistics are classified, but everyone who served knows the numbers are bad. The price of being an apex predator was paid long after the last mission ended. The legacy of the four-eyed ghosts is complicated and will remain so for decades. They were extraordinarily effective warriors who achieved strategic objectives with minimal friendly casualties. They were also human beings who paid a terrible price for their effectiveness, a price that some are still paying today. The technology that made them so lethal also enabled a level of violence that may have been psychologically unsustainable over the long term. History will judge whether the tactical victories were worth the human cost. Taliban fighters still tell stories about the four-eyed ghosts, even though most of the SASR has long since left Afghanistan. The stories have taken on mythical qualities now, growing more elaborate and supernatural with each retelling. Some claim the ghosts could fly, others insist they were actually jinn who took human form. The truth that they were highly trained soldiers with advanced night vision equipment is somehow less believable than the supernatural explanations. The disconnect reveals something profound about the nature of technological warfare. This is perhaps the ultimate measure of their success. They operated so far beyond the enemy's frame of reference that the enemy literally could not conceive of them as human. They became creatures of nightmare, impossible beings who existed in the space between myth and reality. For psychological operations purposes, this was perfect. For the men who actually wore those four-tube devices and hunted through the Afghan night, it was a burden that some never fully set down. The weight of being something more than human proved heavier than any equipment they carried. The GPNVG-18 systems are still in service. Other militaries have developed competing panoramic night vision technologies. The technological arms race continues, with each new generation of equipment promising better clarity, wider fields of view, longer battery life, But the fundamental revolution that occurred in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014 cannot be repeated. That was the moment when night vision technology matured to the point where darkness stopped being a limitation and became a weapon. What happened during those years changed warfare forever. The men who wielded that weapon, who turned the Afghan night into their personal hunting ground, changed warfare in ways that are still being understood. They proved that small numbers of elite operators with technological superiority could dominate a battle space far beyond what their numbers suggested. They demonstrated that the psychological impact of being hunted by an invisible, omniscient enemy could be as effective as conventional military force. And they paid the price that all apex predators eventually pay when the hunting season ends and they have to return to being merely human. The four-eyed ghosts may have left Afghanistan, but Afghanistan never quite left them.